family. Welcome to I'm Not Crazy, but thank you for joining me. I want to begin by just thanking all of the amazing fathers who are in our midst, those people who are doing their thing. Children do not come with a manual, but fortunately, we manage and we are appreciative of the dads in our life, those who were our represent our DNA, those who stepped in, and those mentors and uncles and cousins and grandpas that just did their thing. We are thrilled to celebrate them. But family, as you know, all of us don't have amazing experiences with our father. And so today we're going to talk about Happy Father's Day, surviving Father's Day when it is complicated. And I have an amazing all-star cast to help us process and walk through some of those ugly areas that we're uncomfortable sharing on a day-to-day basis. As I introduce our all-star cast, you do what you do best, and that is rep your city. Tell us where you're tuning in from. Let us know where you are, and we just appreciate you for being loyal listeners. And I want to tell you, I am sure that you know some people who have challenging parent-child relationships, especially with their fathers, and who may be struggling just a little bit, perhaps because their fathers have gone and this is their first Father's Day without them, because they're having challenging relationships, because maybe their fathers died and they weren't in a good place, or they are just emotionally unavailable for whatever reason. This is a good show to share today on your timeline, and I appreciate you for joining me. But let me introduce you to the Dean Ellis, who's always with us all the time. He is a former counselor and an amazing producer, and we're so glad that he is here. Give it up for our own Ellis Dean. We also have Charlie Simpson. He is a therapist and the founder of Arkansas Relationship Counseling. We're appreciative to have him here. He's also, like Ellis, a great father of boys and an amazing mentor to many. We have Dr. Jeff Menzies. He is the psychologist extraordinaire. He's doing his thing in Maryland, also an associate professor. And then we have Harville Howard. He is an entrepreneur and a person who is investing in many young Black men's lives as well, and also a father of sons. So, family, I just want to thank you for tuning in and for joining us. And I want to thank these amazing guys. We have some amazing, wonderful Black men who are making a difference in the lives of their children who are Black men, but as well as the community. So, thank you for joining me. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Good. And
Doing well, doing
Family.
well.
yes, and I also want to say Happy Father's Day in advance. I know that your spouses and partners and children have amazing events planned for you and the like. But I'll get started with what we're here to talk about today, which is when Father's Day is complicated. It's not always an amazing day for some of our dads, and we want to kind of tune in. And sometimes it's not amazing for our kids as well because it brings in a reminder. You all are working with Black men, you're working with youth, you're working with families frequently. What are some of the issues that you all see when Father's Day is approaching with some of the people that you work with? And all of you don't have to answer, but those who want to jump in, go ahead and jump in. And I'll start with you, Dr. Menzies. I think I said that.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Unmute yourself, sir. Yes.
Okay. Uh, yeah, and so this fatherhood question is always one that's kind of delicate, especially within the African American community. There are so many myths and misnomers floating around about Black fatherhood, but then there are also a lot of real to life experiences that people have that make this day kind of contentious. And I find that there's a lot of people who approach with a sense of confusion, unresolved matters with their father, a lot of unanswered questions. And a lot of times those questions center around, why aren't you here? Why did you leave me? Because, especially if the parents split when they were young, when the children were young, or the parents were never together and the child grew up without their father being present. A lot of times when you're very young, you're egocentric, meaning, and so everything revolves around you as a child, meaning that anything that goes good is because of you and anything goes bad is because of you. And with that understanding, children typically take the blame for their parents not being together, for their parents fighting, for their father not being there. And oftentimes that sense of rejection can directly affect self-esteem, and then that in turn impacts relationships going forward. And so for
Yeah,
the adults during this point in time, wondering about fatherhood and Father's Day, especially if they're having a strange father, there are many questions about why my dad isn't there. And I saw in one of the questions, it was about how can I resolve this matter? And a lot of times, if we have an understanding as children, even though we're adults, it's very good for us to go back and revisit those questions as an adult with an adult frame of mind to correct some of the misconceptions of a child.
absolutely. That is definitely one of the questions that I hear sometimes. Why didn't he want me? Particularly if they have witnessed him being a good father to other children. Before we move on to that particular topic, anyone else want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in. One of the complications that I often see in practice is just those individuals that are lost a father, or for those fathers that may be going through a divorce and they don't have the ability to father because of the divorce or different circumstances. But what I often see is those individuals going through a grieving process, and that is just going through that denial that they're not here or I can't father, going through the anger of not being able to father or just not having my father around, and then bargaining, just being able to say, what could I have done differently to maybe have kept my father here, or to not put myself in a situation where I can father. And then you start to see those individuals go through just that depression, those dark places of figuring out, what am I going to do without my father being here, or what am I going to do without not being able to father my kids around this holiday. And then you find a way to get to acceptance. And it's a beautiful thing to watch my clients go to that place of acceptance, of being able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, to be able to, find other ways around not being able to father their kids or their father not being here. But it is a complicated process. But just the hope for those individuals, there is light at the end of the tunnel. You just got to get through that difficult process to get to that acceptance.
Yeah, that's a really good point that both of you made. As we are talking to fathers who want to be present, but sometimes because of the divorce that's contentious, or because of relationships gone awry, they're not able to. But they want their children to know that they want them, even though perhaps the other parent is putting up barriers. How do you go about trying to make sure that your child recognizes that this is not about them, but this is a parental thing? And particularly when one partner is painting the other partner in a very negative light, and you're trying to take the high road. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, Dr. Mattis, can I chime in there?
Yes, please.
And I'll echo a little bit from the previous question. I was my situation, which made it difficult for me, was that my father was incarcerated from when I was 2 or 3 to I was about 15 or 16, and that was just difficult because how do you articulate that? You talk about. I know Brother Simpson known him for quite some time. I didn't have him when I was that age, but being able to internalize it and understand it and all of that was a difficult thing, particularly when you have those programs in school where the dad comes and you got to say your dad working out of town and something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so just the stress that comes along with it made it difficult for me. But I think to this question that you just asked is that my mother was a champion though. Like I don't know what it was in her that understood that. I don't know if she was a psychic or what, but she had a vision to know. She didn't know what the future held, but she allowed me to always go visit him with his family. And that made a difference in terms of me being able to be his caregiver from 2006 until he passed in 2015. And so I say that to your question that it can be healthy. My mom and him, they had their differences, but um, they reconciled in terms of, being able to put their past behind them in order for me and him to have a positive relationship. So I really think parents got to take that ownership in that regard, thinking about the kids.
And I appreciate you saying that, because so many times we hear about parents who are, quote, trying to protect their children, but in fact, they may be hurting them. And so I'm glad to hear that in spite of the fact that he was incarcerated, your mom proactively took those steps, because sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, no, don't let them visit him because can be traumatic. And so it's really good to hear that perspective. Ellis, what would you like to add?
I, I think all of it is complicated, but the first thing I want to say, particularly for people that are watching, is that statistically speaking, black men are the most involved in their children's lives. So I want to kind of dispel that myth off the top, right? So we can make sure that when we're talking about complicated relationships with fathers, that we understand that still, even in these complicated relationships, black men are still the most involved in their children's lives. All right, so let's establish that off the top. Second thing I would say is I like what Dr. Menzies said about the egocentric nature of children. And with parents, when your child is born, you don't get that manual that comes out with them at birth, right? That says, oh, your child at this stage of their life, they're going to be thinking like this. With this stage of your life, they're going to be thinking like that. And you're dealing with complicated adult situations. And so, however, that doesn't provide an excuse for or really help resolve for even that adult child, because when you go you find yourself when you have these complicated parent-child relationships, and I can speak from personal experience because I'm one of those people that had a complicated relationship with his father. When you go back to visit, when you go see them, when you're in their presence, I'm not a 50 something year old person. I'm that same kid that wanted their father to be in their lives. And so we have to understand that that is the perspective of that adult. And so when I was, going through those questions that were submitted by audience, I was like, I can really relate to that because they were speaking. What I was reading was from some of them was the child writing that question, that abandoned child, that abused child, that struggling child was writing that, even though I know it was coming from an adult. And so you know, I know it's a really strange word to say in today's times, but there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of gray areas, and we don't like to speak in those terms. But when we're talking about it, we do have to recognize that that adult that is sitting in front of you now is really speaking from that child that was hurt and maybe traumatized by their father. And so we have to address that when we're trying to find a place for healing for them.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
If I can, since you brought up the stats, I almost said that same thing earlier, Ellis, about statistically speaking, black fathers are the most involved. And I just want to caution us and use the word that you reluctantly use because I didn't want to use it either, but nuanced.
Yep.
Even that stat is nuanced. It's like when you look at the measures. This is self-report, by the way. So this is when men of various races reported how involved they are in their children's lives. How often do you prepare the meals, read to them, put them to bed, feed them, things of that nature. The brothers and the men are saying, yes, I do all the time, this many times a week, twice a month, whatever the scale was. And then we oftentimes use that to try to celebrate. Well, so black fathers are present, and we have to be very careful with that. One, because it's a limited data set, and that report, we're reporting out in true compensatory fashion because we need to compensate for this negative onslaught of perspective and untruths that are launched against black men so often. But on the flip side of that, if we're saying that black men are so involved, then we can no longer say that it's the absence of men and fathers in our communities that gives us the situations that we have, right? And so I wouldn't trade one for the other, right? I still believe that we need viable, healthy, solid men more, in our communities, in our homes, because at the same token, we have that statistic that says that 70 to 80% of black children are raised in a single parent home headed by a mother, right? And so then we're saying, okay, so now, so we're saying that of the relatively small number of black men that are present in the family in the home, they are more involved than right other races. And so we have to really look at that and break that down so we can truly understand what these things mean. And I think that one thing about statistics is that the numbers are what they are, but then they're left to interpretation. So whoever's writing about those stats will lend their own interpretation to it. So that's another thing, another point of caution. But what I also want to put in, insert on this point is this whole thing about children being traumatized by fathers, right? It's almost like men and fathers are always the boogeyman for some reason, and it's like we almost can't even help it to talk about all these traumatic things. But if we also look at some other set of statistics, we'll see that the majority of children are actually physically, emotionally, psychologically, and sexually abused by women. And so then it's like, whoa, right? And it makes sense, right? If we're talking about single parent households predominantly headed by women, then they would be the ones under which whose care the children are the most. And so when you talk about physical abuse or corporal punishment, that's where the statistic has to fall. And so, we this conversation is so nuanced, again, an N word, but we have to use opportunities like this to not necessarily set the record straight, but to give people other opportunities to think about these things in different ways. But the boogeyman father, I think that's a travesty because these children aren't necessarily being traumatized by their father. And what I find is that children as adults oftentimes have the opportunity to what? Hear the other side of the story. Because most of the time we only hear our mother's perspective, we hear the auntie's perspective, we hear our own perspective that we make up in our head. But then when we get a chance to talk to our father, like, Dad, what happened? Why weren't you there? It's like, oh man, you have no idea what it was like. Your mom cheated on me with 5 different people in 2 days. It's like I couldn't handle that. Or I lost my job and had the social pressure of not being able to provide for my family anymore, created great tension in the household. And so, in my own shame and in my own embarrassment, it was easier for me to not be there than to tell you, no, I can't buy you the things that you wanted or needed. We got to learn these stories from the father's mouth.
And those are great points because I frequently hear fathers who want to be involved in their children's lives, and they are and it's not that the mothers mean them harm sometimes. It is that the mom thinks they're a bad influence or they're this or they're that. And you can, regardless of what you're doing, want to be involved in your child's life. And so how do you navigate these relationships when men are saying, because I'm not with the mother, I was good enough for her when I was with her, but now that I'm no longer with her, I'm not good enough for my child. How do you navigate that those without going to jail for catching a charge because you're so angry that these barriers are being placed in front of you when you really drastically just really want a relationship with your child, and every turn there's a barrier. How do you navigate that? And at the end of your answer, please tell a custodial parent, give them encouragement for, don't be wicked like that.
Mhm. Yeah. I think one of the main things, just briefly, is to amplify the voice in those stories. Because again, it still seems like the man is the boogeyman. But if we tell those stories more and more often, if we get into these forums where there are black men able to talk with each other about our issues and what we experience, then you're going to hear these stories repeated over and over and over again. You're going to talk about the subtle manipulation. You're going to talk about the utilizing of children as pawns and as weapons and leverage against the father and against the man. And so when you start to hear those stories more often, and you hear it coming from diverse perspectives and diverse demographics of men, then it's like, oh snap, this might actually be something that occurs. And when it becomes a more common story, then what you have is less pushback. When people hear it, it's not so shocking to the system anymore. And when it's not so shocking to the system, then we can move the social comprehension of the situation forward and progress in our conversation about these things. But right now, we just still give a blanket statement that girls, i.e., women, are made of sugar and spice and everything nice. There could be nothing wrong there. And little boys are made of snakes. Little boys, and therefore men, are made of snakes and snails and puppy dog tails, right? Everything bad. And so men are dogs, men cheat. Now it's about 50-50, And so when we start to tell these truths louder and more consistently and unapologetically, then we're fully capable of moving this conversation forward and actually coming to resolution and solution. So for the non-custodial parents or for the custodial parents out there that's demonizing their partners, you're doing damage to your child. Get over it. Get out of your own feelings, out of your own hurt, your own desires. Allow your child to be with the person that you decided to have the child with, right? Except for if they are actually doing physical and emotional, psychological harm to the child. But it's likely if the parent is being deceitful, they're doing more harm to the child than the parent that's missing.
That's
And
good.
it's interesting. I was going to say it's interesting to hear that everyone on the panel is saying the same thing about the power of the unknown and how the power of the unknown and the individual in that place begin to create their own narrative in a way that makes sense for them. And when we're left in the unknown, and I know everybody is saying, fathers and mothers can, have the same impact on a child as a father. And I know this this interview is mainly about the fathers. But for that hurting child and the narrative that they tell themselves, not just as childhood, but then they take that same narrative until adulthood. And you look at that whole process and you say to yourself, no one came into that child's life and helped him shape that narrative differently. And just to hear Harvell say, I had a mom that came in and helped me shape my narrative of dad differently, so that when I become an adult, I can have a healthy perspective. I can heal that inner child so that I can have meaningful relationships moving forward. And when you leave a child in the unknown place with their own narrative and they take that narrative into childhood, I work with a lot of those unhealthy, or I'm not even going to say unhealthy. I work with a lot of those narratives that those kids had to shape to try to soothe the pain that they're going through internally while they're in adulthood. And just to be able to say, how can you help that child healed or that adult heal that inner child? You have to be able to come out of that unknown place. You have to make sense of that narrative a little bit differently. And when you begin to see things differently, you can take the steps to heal and to have meaningful conversations with dad or mom, so that you don't take and project those same hurts onto your kids and your family. But just to give the hope, is possible. Unfortunately, mom, dad might not have the skills to be able to help you create that new narrative. So you might have to find somebody that can come in and help you reshape that narrative. But when you're able to accomplish that, you see things so much differently. And when they're able to achieve that goal, they'll see that they don't have to take that hurt child with them into adulthood.
Yeah.
Dr. Maddox, I'd like to just add one thing. I remember someone saying earlier about a dad not being able to see his kid now, but he was good enough to be with her when they were good, but he can't see his kid.
Mm,
But what my mom did, it was genius. She talked about his strong suits. I guess those things that she liked about him,
Mhm.
and I didn't know. I heard the other things about the streets, around the way, but I never got it from her. And
Mm.
so she talked about how intelligent he was, about him being one of the few blacks in
hmm
the early '80s to get a company vehicle for this particular company. And so I was like, my dad was doing that because all I knew was him locked
hmm
up. And
Mhm.
so, but
hmm
she would talk about those things like that, and that don't take a training or anything. All you gotta
Mhm.
do is just talk about what attracted you to that man, to your kids, and let the other
It's
stuff fall where it
powerful.
fall, because that's gonna happen anyway. They're gonna find out who he is regardless, and he may be rehabilitated at some point, and
Yeah.
but you just never know. But my mom left that up. She didn't make that decision for me. That's all I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I was just say this. It doesn't take training, but it does take a certain level of self-awareness, right, in order to recognize that, and that was a selfless act that your mother did by saying, I'm not going to paint whatever your father was incarcerated for. I'm going to paint him in a light that's going to make him seem positive to you. And so, therefore, you were able to go, even in his situation, and see him in a positive light. So, kudos. I echo what Bethany put in the comment, is that your mom sounds amazing, because she was. My mother was neutral, right? When my father was doing off his thing, she wouldn't say. She was raised in that era where you didn't talk about those bad things. It was hush hush. You swept it under the rug, and then that narrative is. As Charlie was talking about, in terms of narrative that I had in my head, was I wasn't good enough to
Mhm.
make my father want to come home and see me, or come to my baseball game and see me play, or come to my soccer match and see me play. And so that narrative gets played out, and there was nobody in that space when I was being developed, when I was growing up, developing, to say, no, that narrative is wrong. You are good enough, and you need that person in your life. And so, what we're trying to correct here is get people to recognize those narratives, as Charlie talked about, and use Harvell's mom's example as a way to combat those narratives, so they can see their parent as who they are, and give their parent the opportunity to either shape or create a new narrative in their lives.
And
You
so
know,
another point in that same line, excuse me, Dr. Maddox, real
no, no,
quick.
go ahead.
is that sometimes the mother was also attracted to the bad things, and so if we have fathers that are hustlers, fathers that are out there in them streets, a lot of times they didn't just turn into that after the relationship began. A lot of times they were that before the relationship began, and and
Man, you
so
about to go in a whole nother direction right there.
no, but see, but this is a part of that though. This is a part of the conversation
Right,
that
you
has to be
correct.
had because right now what we're talking about is, and it's rightfully so. The mothers deserve all of the praise for not slandering the fathers of their children, right? And the next step in that conversation is to say, and I actually was down with that. I kept me dressed in the best clothes, had all the jewelry, kept money in my pocket. That's the streets was hustling. But then when he got popped and he got arrested, and then we were left without that fast money. Now all of a sudden we're in a different situation, a different circumstance. I got time to reflect on how that actually wasn't helpful to us, right? And so it's not it's good, but we've got to take it all the way, y'all. And recognize, because when I talk to sisters, and a lot of times women don't like the good guys, and oftentimes the good guy is not the first choice. The good guy is the settled choice, right?
Speak on it.
And it's just like when it comes to when it comes to who you're gonna have children with, right? And who you're gonna bear children with, or if we talk about paternity, who you're gonna put the child on, right? And
All
you could,
right.
we could do all of this for Father's Day if y'all want to, but it's like, but all of these things are part of the conversation, right? It's an old saying that says what? Mother's baby, daddy's maybe, right?
Yes.
And if a woman has the opportunity, and those some who have had the opportunity, like for example, 30% of the paternity tests that occur, as a question of the courts and paternity, uh, 30% of those come back. The man who was told he was the father is not the father, and that's just in that small pool of people. So imagine if there's a big raging debate right now about mandatory paternity testing, right, at birth, and then there's also on the flip side of that a conversation about child support beginning at conception, which then means that somebody could say, hey, this is your baby at conception, and you got to ride that out until you get a test, right? And the baby gets here to you get paternity test. But anyway, it's like the mandatory testing gets so much pushback. And if you look at the people who are giving the pushback, it's a majority of women saying that's not right. And it's like economic reasons and things of that nature. But if you look at the stats, if you look at the number of people who are raising children that aren't theirs, men that are raising children that aren't theirs, knowingly and not knowingly, it actually should be something that occurs. Oh, let me say this. It makes sense for it to be something to be put on the table for discussion, because men have the right to know if the child is theirs or not biologically, and then they make the decision on whether or not they're going to continue if the child is not theirs biologically. Last thing, you'll find on some of these crazy talk shows, you're not the father type talk shows, to where if there's a young man who finds out that it's not his biological child, and if his mother is present on that stage, one of the most common narratives and responses by the mother to her son is, you're going to be a man anyway. And you've already been there for this baby and for her, and you're going to take care of this child anyway. That's the typical response that a mother gives to her child. I've never seen a mother look back at the girl like, why did you do this to my son? She stands in unison with the girl that has just deceived her son. And so these are all of the things that kind of confuse us as men about how we're supposed to, one, approach this question of fatherhood, and how we should definitely approach this question of manhood, because we get so many mixed signals about what a man actually is and what a good man would do.
Woo! It
Yeah,
just got
you hit.
good to my sanctified soul. So,
Yeah.
family, if you were just tuning in, we are talking about when Father's Day is complicated. And you should just go ahead and hear this, because this is really good, particularly if you came on late. Now, I want to check in with our audience. We have one statement from Ross Warren. As an adult who didn't have my dad as a child, I had to decide to unlearn the narrative that I had created about him in my own head. Now I'm in my 50s, and I created a relationship with my dad, and I feel like a little girl every time I'm with him because I didn't get to experience him on that level. Man, it's the best feeling. I'm so grateful that I didn't hold him to the lies I had told myself about him. And as I was reading that, one of the things that came to my mind was, I remember when my father's cousin told me he was the most noble man he knew. And that struck me because I had not heard anything from my mother about my father, period. like nothing. And so when I started to develop a relationship with his family, they were amazing. My dad, absolutely an amazing guy. And he wanted to marry my mom, but she wouldn't marry him. And he went to the military. And so she didn't tell me anything about him. And for a little while, she wouldn't let him see me. So to hear from his relatives that he was an amazing guy, I actually started to resent her because she kept that that group of people away from me. And so I think as women, many times we have these things that are playing out in our head, and we penalize good guys, decent guys, some flawed guys, but we penalize them for not being in relationship with us. And we don't realize that we're not winning because we think it's about him winning or us winning. The child is losing. It doesn't matter if you or the dad wins. If the child loses, that's not good. Man, this is good. Oh, this is good. Ellis, you look like you got something to say.
I'm just it's. I think I'm curious about the question about how do you forgive, right, without having to go down this whole path of what you know. I'm happy Roz had her great experience, right, and so and as I started learning more about my own father's past, I recognized the trauma that he experienced in Vietnam, and then also from my grandfather not being the nicest man. Uh, he didn't have a lot of great role models, and then he had this traumatic experience by going to war and surviving that, and then coming back to a country that was still calling him, N-word and all kind of stuff, and so there was a lot of just social psychological trauma that he experienced, and so I forgave him for that part of his experience. Um, but as as we're an adult, how much do you hold him accountable for the decisions he made as an adult and as a parent? And so, yes, we can understand that somebody has gone through trauma, but they still have the power to decide how they are going to, express themselves, particularly in the relationships that they chose to be part of. Um, and that's the part, the struggle that even at 50 plus, I still have in terms of trying to engage with him as his health is declining and I'm going down there, but I don't have a relationship with him, so I don't feel that same connection to want to, you know, I do it mainly out of obligation and understanding that, hey, I do have care and concern for a relative, but I don't feel that connection. And how do you reconcile that guilt, right? Forgiveness. There's a lot of feelings that go into there. That's what we're talking about, that N-word nuance earlier. There's a lot of nuance that comes into this scenario.
Yeah.
There's one thing, in response to you, brother Ellis, as far as the forgiveness piece. You know, one thing I would suggest is for people in general to understand what trauma is, and to understand that there is a whole aspect to the trauma response that is outside of the person's control, right? Because you said, you mentioned that he had choice, and he does have a part of that to bear, but there's so much in trauma, the experience in the trauma, that's beyond choice, right? Like, for example, if you look at like the diagnostic criteria for like PTSD, for example, some of it is hypervigilance, and so hypervigilance means that you have a heightened sense of defensiveness in the presence of certain things that may be triggering, the emotions related to the trauma, and that's an unconscious process right there, right? And so if a person is mean, angry, rigid, strict, needing to maintain control of their environment, sometimes that's a unconscious protective factor. And I'm not giving any excuses, just trying to offer understanding, because many of us have fathers that are like that, right? Especially those in the older generations who came back from war, or who were just in the streets, or who faced the insidious nature of racism on a day-to-day basis, right? Um, and so, with those types of understandings, I think that it allows room for more forgiveness. Oh, you mean to tell me that he was actually dealing with a mental health issue that was undiagnosed, but he was able to function to the degree that he was? But hey, you mean to tell me that that's what depression can look like, in a man? And then also, I think this society, even the field of mental health, as psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, it's a very feminine field, feminine as opposed to masculine. So it's very soft, it's very nurturing, in many respects of it. And therefore, we take a lot of our perspectives from that same orientation, right? And so I had a colleague of mine recently talk about, they were at a movie, they were out watching The Warrior King. I mean, The Warrior Queen. Ironically, they were at the movie Warrior Queen, and there was this brother there. And she was telling me, like, the little kid fell, and the father looked at the son. It was a son. Said, looked at his son. Said, "Are you okay?" Kind of affirmative, like, "Are you okay?" And the little boy just kind of looking. He wanted to cry or whatever. And the father said, "Are you okay?" And my colleague, who was a woman, said he asked the child 3 times, and then the child finally said yes. And the child, you could tell the child was fighting back tears. And she said all of the women and the mothers that were there were all kind of, oh, they wanted to intervene on behalf of the child. And the story was told as if the father did something wrong. And so I jumped in and said, "So what was the problem with what the father did? Is it just because he didn't do what you all thought he should have done in that situation?" I said, "He asked the child if he was okay. He gave the child the stability and the strength that the son needed in that moment to say, there's no need to go to pieces over falling just now. There's no need to bust out in tears and go into hysteria right now. You can control the emotional response to a situation like this." And that's a part of the difference between fatherhood and motherhood. You know, Typically speaking, a father would provide that type of guidance, that type of response. And last point I make really quickly in that same thread is this. I once heard a story from a brother who was in prison, and he said that the reason he asked another inmate, why do you think all these men are in here? He said they committed a crime. And he said, but really it boils back down to them not having a father present. And so what they had is all of the testosterone and all of the other maleness, but they were missing the guidance of an adult male. And so what they had was the preponderance of guidance from adult females. And so they took the female socialization, coupled it with the testosterone and all of that stuff, and they had no discipline and control of their emotional responses, and they did things that landed them in this prison situation.
Will you tell us the story about the elephants before you finish up?
Okay, and so, but that's again, that's another right. That's another appropriate point. Is that the adult male elephants, and I'll abbreviate it. The adult male elephants provide not through their physical presence, but also through a hormone that they excrete, a literal checking of the children elephant or the younger male elephants that are in their environment. And without this adult male elephant in that check mode, in that natural role of checking and helping to guide and direct the young male development, these young male elephants went wild, destroyed their community, and attacked other animals within their environment, which was unnatural to them, especially when there were adult male elephants present at the same time.
I wanted to lead with that story, and I didn't get around to it, but I really appreciate you sharing. There have been so many golden nuggets. Let me just go to our audience so that I can make sure we include some of this. Bethany Holloway Williams says, "I think women are not held accountable for being promiscuous, nor do they accept their responsibility in situations where the identity of the father is not known." Great point, Bethany. Um, she also says at some point that, that's sad. Harvell, your mom sounds like an amazing lady, was something else that was said. Family, thank you for tuning in. If you showed up a little bit late, I do encourage you to share it on your timeline so people can see this. Anybody want to jump in and
Doc-
further comment?
Dr. Maddox, I like to say something about Ellis's point earlier, and it makes me think about um, it, I have an older brother who shared that same father, and it's actually I was actually in more relationship with him because he was older. His mom and my dad had divorced 10, 15 years before he met my mother and married. Um, but they didn't meet again until my brother was about 30. So they were estranged. And so, I thought about that long and hard because I was closer to my dad than him. But this is what I truly believe, and I say this to my brother and even to you, Ellis. I really believe that um, relationship is key, meaning status without relationship to me is void in a sense. So the father to me is not a right that we just going to come and do and all of this stuff. I think there's got to be some kind of a bridge that was built, or either mended in order to actually take on this type of relationship that sometimes some fathers think it's just automatic because that's their name. They were our biological father. But you got to have some kind of relationship, whether either I initiated or he initiated. But without it, to me, it's almost like sometimes we can beat ourselves up a lot about that. And because the relationship was never there, I don't necessarily think that you can feel like it was your fault. Because I think sometimes we can beat ourselves up as kids, thinking it's always our on us to make the initiation. When a father, he may have never learned how to do it, but never did that. And so, but we still have that vulnerability around taking those steps to mending it. Now, Dr. Maddox, you're the expert on how we mend it, and even Brother Simpson. But I just feel like sometimes as kids, we sometimes put a lot of pressure on us to make those relationships happen. And I was fortunate enough to have, as I mentioned earlier, the facilitation by my mom and then his family that got me there. But even going to see my dad, it was awkward 2, 3 times a year. It wasn't easy calling him dad. I don't think I called him dad until he got out. And then even when he got out, it took several years of me having a relationship with him in order to say that because we didn't have a relationship. I was seeing a man who was my father, but we didn't have a relationship. So that's why I say status, our position in without relationship is void.
Oh,
And I
that's
wanted
so.
to say, yeah, I wanted to say, Harville, I appreciate you for your story. And I want to say to you, Dr. Maddox, thank you for this platform. Yvonne said it clearly in the chat. She said this is a place where we can be vulnerable. We could have no judgment. And, these types of platforms are really the first step of healing for a lot of people that are sitting in the unknown, feeling unloved, feeling like they're not enough, feeling worthless, feeling uncared for. And when they have opportunities to hear these types of um, stories, and the Toastmasters is really big for us, and we know the power of stories and being able to utilize stories to impact other people. But when we hear those stories, just like everyone is saying on the panel, what do we do with them? Do we just hear a good story and say, wow, I want that joy? Or do we say, man, that sounds good, but I'm not ready to go into this hurt that I've had closed up for 50 years? And, I want to just challenge those that are listening to just say, hey, if you at a place where you need to keep the hurt closed up, that's just where you are right now. Don't beat yourself up. Give yourself grace and say, hopefully one day I can get to a place where I can face this hurt. But if you are at a place to say, I'm ready for joy, whatever that means to you, take that step to say, what can I do to start facing these hurts? Whether it was a mom hurt, whether it was a dad hurt, what do I need to do to start looking at the narrative that I created and reshaping that narrative, just like um, Roz was saying, so that I can see mom or dad or even myself differently. And I just hope that this conversation will impact someone out there listening to say, maybe I need to start looking inwardly at some stuff that I've had packed away for years.
Excellent point. One thing that I will tell you that I hear whenever I work a lot with the people who use substances, and I will frequently say, what does it do for you? And more times than not, I hear one of three responses. It helps me numb and forget, it helps me calm down, or it helps me to sleep. And when they're talking about the numbing and forgetting, it is related to abuse at the hands of mom or dad that they want to forget. And what I say to them is, do you want to have a happy family one day? Do you want to be a happy person one day? And I need you to understand that numbing for moments or for a half a day may temporarily do the fix, but it is unpacking for a bit of time and getting to that so that you can bring your best self to the table with that that guy or that gal that you want. Many times we wait until we're in the thick of a relationship, screwing it all the way up before we decide, I think I need to get therapy. No, darling, don't wait till you are messing up some other human being to decide, I think I need therapy. Do that before you meet that person so that you can bring your best self to parenting, so you can bring your best self to your work environment, and so you can just bring your best self to you. And we don't always get that. My question for you all is, after, many times we have lies that we've been fed or that we've been told, and even after we realize that it's not a lie, it impacts us. And there are times when particularly women who were not raised by their parents or whatever, or their fathers not involved, will have some issues with affection, with men being affectionate with their children. They're, hyper vigilant. And I can say I definitely am, as a psychiatrist, hyper vigilant when I see little girls sitting on men's laps and stuff like that. And I remember one question was, because the woman had been physically or sexually abused by her father, she really struggled with letting her husband do what dads do with girls. Pick them up, throw them in the air, catch them, sit on laps and stuff like that. And so she was talking with her therapist, and yes, she had a therapist, and said, I just don't want him to steal her innocence. And the therapist said, but you were stealing it. How do we then, after we have been victimized and traumatized, bring a healthy self to parenting so that we don't become our parents? Does that question make sense?
That's a tough therapeutic approach, for that clinician to say to her. But what I would say is, I appreciate your protection. Your protection of your daughter is just to be able to say, I don't want other people to feel what I felt. And because I don't want other people to feel what I felt, I find myself maybe overprotecting and taking away connections that my daughter would have with other people. And I would have to go back to just saying, um, it sounded like you wanted somebody to come in and protect you when you were that little girl. Now, what I want you to share with me is, what is it like to be in an unprotected place? Now I'm opening up pain, I'm opening up hurt, because the only way you can truly heal a dad, a mom hurt is I have to go back to it, and I have to be in that place to see it and to feel it. And when I'm in that place, I can start to see that moment differently. And so, I want to hear what she's trying to protect daughter from. I want to know those feelings. I want to know, that experience, because once she's in that place, she then will be able to say, you know what, I did have a grandmother that came in. I remember I had an uncle that came in and loved me and showed me that it's okay to have a male figure hug me. And oftentimes we can't see those people that came into our hurt and tried to be there because of the hurt disguising those things. And so we have to be careful when we see people behaving in ways that we would see as unhealthy, of just being able to go back to the place where they learned those unhealthy skills, and what was that unhealthy skill protecting in the moment.
That's good.
And,
That's
and,
good.
and then meanwhile, I'm sorry. And,
No,
and meanwhile, while we're going through that therapeutic process to help, which could often be a long process, because you're asking a person to search their history and their unconscious, right? Meanwhile, I'm pretty sure that the person in that scenario is not only damaging their child, but also their relationship with their
yes,
husband or the man, the father of their child.
Hmm.
And so we're also asking them to be patient while this person slowly unpacks all of this stuff. And
Right.
I think that that's why it's important, to your point, Dr. Maddox, that these things happen on the front end. Where we make it a part of our culture to unpack your bags before you jump in a relationship with somebody,
yes,
right? Let's try that. Let's try to do that. Let's stop putting the cart before the horse. You know what I mean? And because that's actually very irresponsible, of a person to
Mm,
know that they've got that trauma that they haven't addressed. And that's not victim blaming. That's, and I'm leaning back on what we talked about a little bit earlier, Ellis, where it's just like, the accountability on the person who has
Yep.
been injured. So to the degree that they are aware of their injury and to the degree that they are aware of the behaviors that are resulting from their injury is the same degree to where they can be responsible for dealing with that stuff. But the thing about change is that people typically change only when staying the same is more painful than that process of change.
Yes.
So
Yep.
that means if I stay like this and it's gonna hurt me more to stay like this than it will for me to go through that process of healing, let me go ahead and go through this process of healing. But that's a lot of the reason why
you
people are
right.
hesitant about surgeries and stuff. Because they like, I've been walking on this bad hip for 20 years. I done got used to it. I'm all right with it. Right. And they're scared that going into surgery, the healing process, after you got to break, sometimes cut in, break that hip and reseal it, even put a replacement in there. But the majority of people that I've ever met that had hip replacement surgeries, after they get it done and it's done properly and they heal correctly, they are so happy that they did it because they didn't realize how much pain they were in until they were able to get out of that pain. And so I think
And
that,
then and I was gonna say, and then we have to face just the cultural aspect of the resiliency that we have in the African American community to deal with pain the way that we deal with it, and that's a whole other segment right there. But we are taught to carry pain,
yep,
to be strong, especially as fathers, dads, to be tough and push that pain to the side. And we do have to get to a place where just like Dr. Menzie was saying, that we can't allow our strength to be our deficit. We have to be able to say, I have to put my strength to the side and face some stuff that is not going to look very pretty. And unfortunately, just like Dr. Menzie was saying, we only wait until the trauma becomes trauma before they come in, and we just have to continue these conversations to educate, to break that stigma, to say, hey, you got to go do a car checkup. You just can't keep running a car and not check up. You gotta have that checkup mentally to make sure that you're not taking, and I think we're doing a pretty good job with breaking that stigma. And once again, Dr.
Well,
Maddox,
I was
thank you
doing
for
a
just this
decent job.
conversation. A decent job.
We're coming along a little bit better. I don't even know if we're doing a decent job, but we're coming along. Family, we have been having an amazing conversation about this, and we are probably about 7 minutes out right now. So I'm going to start with what I hate to do because this could go on for a lot longer as far as I'm concerned. But I want you to think about what you wish you had said that you intended to say that you've not said yet, and share with our viewers just a couple of points as we're parting ways. And I'll start with you, Harvell, and I'll start with you.
Sure. Just one point that came to my mind in that last segment that we were talking about adult children healing. I believe that sometimes we just got to just remember that sometimes the end result isn't always a relationship, but it could just be forgiveness, yourself
Mm,
and the parent. And I say the parent, and this is the father's kind of focus, but I think a great illustration of that, and one of my favorite films for teaching and a lot of things around abuse and stuff was Antoine Fisher. When he saw his mother for the first time, he was okay with the piece of just telling her how he felt and forgiving her and then moving forward without a relationship with her. So I think we just have to remember that it isn't always the end result is a relationship. It could just be forgiving yourself and them and moving forward with a healthy life.
excellent point. Excellent point. And I love that you mentioned that because many of the people that I work with talk about how pressured they feel to have relationships with parental figures who are toxic to them. And I want to say on their behalf, understand that when you're having that conversation, you're judging them by what you think their parents may have been like in a healthy role. Before people decide to be estranged from their parents, they've taken a whole lot of other measures before that. So I want to gently tell you to mind your own business as it relates to that. Okay.
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
uh, and Dr. Jeff. Parting words.
Okay, yeah, and it's been a great discussion. It's always a pleasure to to serve with my brothers on panels like this. One thing is, as parents, take accountability, take responsibility for your actions, the models that you're setting for your children and your family, the energy that you bring into your household, into the dynamic. And for those that are estranged, be honest about the estrangement, age appropriately, of course. But then on the flip side of that, as children, when it comes to us negotiating our relationship with our fathers, it's very important for us to become as mature as possible, for us to become as free of baggage as possible for those engagements. Because what I find a lot of times is that the parent, specific in this case, the father, when he finally does get a chance to talk to his children after however many years, a lot of times they're in compensatory mode. They're trying to make up for lost time. And that could come with a lot of emotionality, a lot of shifting, blame shifting, and all that type of stuff. But as a mature child, being able to listen and allow that stuff to come out and venting and not taking it personal, not being defensive, will allow for the conversation to go further. So everybody do your own healing. Parents, be responsible. Children, give a little grace and have a little bit of understanding that you might not understand it the way that it really is.
Excellent point, Dr. Menzies. Excellent points. Charlie.
I've talked enough. Everybody is saying great information. The number one thing is if you start to ask yourself, am I okay? That's a sign you might want to go and have somebody make sure that you are. Don't wait until the traumatic event happens before you have to go. When you start to feel that something is happening internally that feels uncomfortable, take those steps. And, our facility, the Arkansas Relationship Counseling Center, we have really good free phone consultation that can just really see, hey, do we need to schedule an appointment or not? But don't feel like you have to walk this journey of life alone.
Great point. Good. And I would dare say, particularly if you are a Black man watching this, um, going to finding yourself a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist that shares culture with you, that you feel like you will be able to just be transparent and not judged abusive, but worked with. Do consider doing that now while you're not at rock bottom, while there are no big issues, so that you can bring your best self to the table. And finally, the Mr. Ellerstein, parting words.
Um, what I would just say is for the parents, find that clarity, find that self awareness. I would also say when you become a parent, if you had experienced some trauma as a child, remember those promises, right? And that we are kids. Remember you're a kid and something your parents did something wrong to you, and you say, when I become a parent, I'm gonna never do this, right? Keep that promise to yourself, right? Because they say it in church all the time. Generational curses are real, and so the only way to break them is to become fully aware of them and to make it a point every single day. And so when I had children of my own, I said, I'm not going to have my child look in that stands and not see their parent there rooting them on. And so, but it took effort and still working on it on a daily basis. The reason why I got into counseling in the first place, because I was like, what's wrong with me? I'm trying to figure out me. And so I got into counseling and I said, okay, well, kind of figure out what's wrong with me. Let me try to help some other people figure out what's going on with them. And so find that self-awareness, keep that promise to yourself. And I like what Charlie said about giving yourself some grace. Because if you don't give yourself some grace, the world won't either. So give yourself some grace. And being strong is doesn't mean not asking for help. That is a conflation that tends to happen all the time. I'm strong. I don't need no help. No, no, no. You're strongest when you ask for help and you receive it completely. So, thank you all for listening to my verbal vomit here today, and, and, uh, and we will continue this at some point, probably later on.
Absolutely. And I just want to thank you all for joining us. I think I inadvertently got mostly alpha men on this podium today. So that was an accident. I didn't see it coming. Want to thank you all for coming. And if you were listening and you found this to be a little bit challenging or uncomfortable or what have you, good. Healing feels uncomfortable. It looks ugly sometimes. It looks snotty nosed and teary eyed. But I encourage you to invest in you so that you can bring your best self forward. I appreciate you all for tuning in. And I just want to encourage you, of course, to don't hit rock bottom, get therapy. Um, Pay attention to what you're doing. Do keep the promise. Now, I've not kept the promise. I said I was going to be nothing like my mother. I promise you. I say stuff like, you don't believe that big reason, but you will. More times than I can count. Hard head, make it soft. I look like her and I sound like her much more than I want to. But what I will say, when you're making the mistakes of your parents, invest in a safe place that you can be confidential and you can work through that. And finally, don't parent with humility and apologize when you know you've done wrong to your children. Please apologize. Again, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank each of our amazing guests. Weren't they phenomenal? Family, if you would, you go into the chat and tell people how to reach you, because there may be some people who want to invest in your services or have you come speak or what have you. Let them know in the chat at blackdoctor.org how to reach you. And finally, share. I thank you. I'll see you same time, same place next week from 11 to 12 Central Standard Time and 12 to 1 Eastern Time. Have an amazing day. I appreciate you. And again, thank you, guests. You've been amazing.
Thank you.
Real quick before we go, I do want to tell our audience that they will be able to get more of Dr. Jeff. He is going to be starting a show here on blackdoctor.org called Mentality. That's MEN, Tality with Dr. Jeff Aziz. And his first program will be on Tuesday. I'm not going to spoil the surprise, but his first program will be on Tuesday at 8 p.m. as part of our Men's Health Summit here on blackdoctor.org. So we're going to be talking about men's health issues. We're going to be talking about heart health. We're going to be talking about prostate health, and we're going to talk about mental health. And Dr. Jeff has got a special guest coming to talk about mental health with him on Tuesday. You do not want to miss that, and you're hearing it first here on Dr. Rhonda's show. So check out next week, and after that you will see Dr. Menzies every week here on blackdoctor.org, trying to get our men get their mind right, because you see I still got some issues I got to deal with. So
All of you.
Y'all,
y'all take it easy.